Hello from wherever you are, and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in both French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom left side of your screen. The webinar is also live streamed on the ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel, where you could also find the recordings of every past session. You can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. This webinar is made possible because of the support from our partners and sponsors, and I would like to use the opportunity to acknowledge the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Net Initiative, and the Cashew Club. Please be reminded that the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is taking place this year in November from 18 to 22nd at the GNICC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. You register before August 31st and you enjoy the early bird rates. Let's now welcome Jim for the 80th session of the Global Market Encounter. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you too?
All good indeed. A little bit of a quiet period in the market, but still some interesting news around and some strange events.
We are all ears. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Stella. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Wherever you are, you're very welcome. Today we're going to talk about markets. You won't be surprised by that. And we're also going to take a really long-term view on this business. We're going to talk a little bit about what the cashew sector or industry or business might look like in 2035. And really, we're looking at that in order to see what are the lessons we can learn from where we are now and where we might be 10 years from now. Let's start and have a look at some markets. And we'll have a look at some of the news. This week's session is structured a little bit differently, by the way, because we've had 2 weeks in a row. So we're just going to do this one a little bit differently in order to give some variety. Well, overall, I think the trading has been fairly quiet. There's been some sales of kernels, some interesting sales from African countries at premium prices. 1 or 2 Vietnamese processors have been unable to resist the temptation and dipped their prices, but not many. Market still looks pretty steady. The Vietnamese industry, I understand, is preparing to talk to the government. Definitely in need of support if these tariffs go through. So the industry is going to talk to their government and fill the government in on how they see the future of the sector. In Burkina Faso, we understand that there's a negotiation going on, a discussion maybe as to how to end the export suspension. I haven't heard any confirmation of this, but I understand that there's some discussion going on regarding the allocation of raw cashew nuts to processors. Big logistical issues in African ports. This is what happens when the season starts slow and then starts to pick up, no surprise there. And RCN traders, again, no surprise, talking the market up, probably without justification. And that's what traders tend to do. When the market is quiet and sales are few, they talk. And what are they saying? Here's a sample for you. So if someone says, quality is falling in Côte d'Ivoire, it's raining. Be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. It does that every year. Nigeria is offering significantly less volumes than last year. I'd love to know what significant means. Is significant 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100%? I don't know. But actually the crop is down a little on the expectations, maybe a little bit down on last year, but people are reporting anywhere from 60 to 70% is already in and in warehouses ready to be processed, and processing is increasing, are ready to be exported. Most of it probably already sold. Ivory Coast is reserving 50% of its crop for processing. That's from Vietnam. Well, it's not true either. That 50% is a target for 2030. This year, we guess around about 400,000, a little bit more than that, will be processed. That'll be about a third of the crop, around about 30%, not much more than that. You will hear that reports that processors have bought 650,000 tonnes, which might be about half the crop. But don't forget, most of the processors are also traders and exporters of raw cashew nuts. In fact, in my opinion, too many of them are traders and exporters of raw cashew nuts because the two activities are not compatible. So Ivory Coast is not reserving 50% of its crop for processing. Processors are probably going to process 400, hopefully a little bit more than that this year, 1,000 tonnes, and the rest will be exported as usual. Someone else said to me that several African countries are moving to protect their domestic processing sectors by imposing export bans on RCN. Several? One. Only one country has actually banned the export of raw cashew nuts, that's Benin. One has a temporary suspension, and as I said, there's a bit of a discussion going on around that at the moment. And even the one major supplier has failed to implement the export ban, so that the material is coming out anyway. What else is being said? Guinea-Bissau and Senegal are experiencing high volume trades. Well, they're not yet. It's early in May, maybe a little bit early in Senegal, but it's not high volume trades. And China is gradually, another one from Vietnam, China is gradually shifting away from Vietnamese cashew kernels by sourcing RCN from Cambodia. Of this, there is no evidence. The Cambodian government policy is to process and to develop processing and to invest in processing. And by the way, who will process the raw cashew nuts? And when we look at, in a few moments, when we look at Vietnam's imports from Cambodia so far this year, it's pretty obvious that Chinese buyers are not particularly active in raw cashew nuts. So there is a lot of talk around. Be careful what you listen to. Be careful how it's phrased. In fact, if you look at a lot of those statements, perhaps by the last one, they could all be qualified and talked about as being true, but not in the way they're presented and not for the reason they're presented. So be careful who you listen to. And what's really happening on RCN prices at the moment is that the quality of the material arriving in West Africa is declining, as it tends to do as the season advances in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, and further west in Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, parts of Guinea, you get higher quality material that trades at higher prices. So what we've seen in Cote d'Ivoire, prices under pressure, particularly at the farm gate at the moment, unfortunately, and in Nigeria also a wide range of quality and therefore a wide range of price. In Ghana, Ghana's almost finished. Quality is declining. There might be a little bit less due through Ghana this year on the western border, but that may be because Cote d'Ivoire is being more careful about the export, the illegal export from their point of view across the border into Ghana. So when we look at it, what we're seeing is that farm gate prices are falling as quality is declining. Minimum prices at the farm gate are under pressure, definitely in Cote d'Ivoire, that's for sure. Probably in Burkina too. International market prices are lower. I'm calling it maybe $30 to $50 lower, but the sentiment is definitely lower. Market prices, and these are the levels that we hear in the market, they're still well above the cost of production of cashew kernels. Not for African processors, but by the time you bring them to Vietnam, and particularly because Vietnam resells in the export market. Perhaps less so of a problem in India because the Indian market is protected. Prices are higher for kernels as a result. But definitely, if we look at the general calculation, African raw cashew nuts don't make much sense for a processor. And as a result, processes are likely to continue to take their time. But they can only wait a limited period, as we'll see. What about cashew kernels? Well, as I said, we did see one or two little dips in Vietnam, one or two people selling a little bit lower. Maybe they need to liquidate stock, get some cash in. Maybe they hadn't got forward sales. We know forward sales were less this year. Market not really changed, I don't think. Processors are relatively tight for stock, not short of stock, but relatively tight. And there should be no real pressure on them to do anything other than export the contracts that they've already committed to. In Africa, still premium prices. I've heard prices up in the mid 360s for top quality material from East Africa. Tanzanian cashew kernels in big demand at the moment. And in West Africa, good certified quality suppliers still making 360 plus. One or two people a little bit nervous perhaps, selling a little bit lower. So the market's steady, touchdown, and we're still well above the levels of last year. Demand still looks pretty okay, and some US buyers are active, others are not. Often they're active for prompt shipment, but generally, as we discussed last week, the tariffs are having the effect, or the tariff negotiations are having the effect of slowing down business. Let's go back to RCN and let's have a look at what's been happening in Vietnam. Now, you might recall a couple of weeks ago, I was pointing out that Vietnam's imports were way behind last year, and that in order to catch up, shipments would need to be almost double of 2024. And it's remarkable. 480,901 tons were imported in April. The overall level of raw cashew nuts imports have gone from 36% down on 2024 at the end of March to 8% up at the end of April. And as you can see, by the end of April, with over 1 million tons imported, the number is bigger than any previous year. This is quite a remarkable turnaround and tells us something about Cambodia, which I'll come to in a moment. But just on that subject, look at almost 760,000 tons were imported into Vietnam from Cambodia, January to April. This is quite a turnaround and changes the dynamic from that which many expected in recent weeks. So we're looking at the best April on record, 9.5% up versus 2024. And it's interesting that we look at exports. Very good export performance during April. Somewhat surprising. First half of the month was down 12% on last year, but the second half of the month was up 30% on last year. So April has been quite surprising and actually quite spectacular. What is it about? Could be, we'll have a look at that in a moment, could be US buyers trying to stock up a little bit ahead of the revision or the final announcement or the renegotiation of these trade tariffs in July. If you think about April, May, June, you can have this material into the United States. I think it's at the 10% rate. You can have that in June. If you were to build an inventory on that, well, you're going to be able to sell it anyway, and there's a chance that you might have a huge advantage on import duty. We'll see. However, the overall situation of exports from Vietnam, and don't forget, Vietnam is a great benchmark for us because Vietnam is supplying over 70% of the world's traded cashews, the world's export cashews. So if Vietnam is down, it's a fair indicator of where demand is. January, April, Vietnam's down 10% versus 2024. But don't forget, and I know I keep saying this, but don't forget that 2024 was really a record year. 10% down on last year doesn't necessarily mean a major reversal because it's 20% up on the previous year. So it's very interesting to look at the situation. Signals are mixed. let's have a look at it maybe country by country. Also, let's just work out what this means. So if imports are up by about the equivalent of 78,500 tonnes and exports are down by the raw cashew equivalent of 100,000 tonnes, that's an additional supply of something like 180,000 tonnes. That's about 21 days processing stock. If you think 26 days, working days in a month, it's about a month, getting them close to a month of additional. Now, April was a little bit better in terms of exports, so that 21 days might be more than a month, because we would expect something of a slowdown in May. You would expect that buyers might back off a little bit, US buyers particularly might back off a little bit during May, just to see how the tariff situation works out. So what does all of this tell us about Cambodian production? Well, there's the Vietnam's import figures. We don't have Cambodia's export figures because they come a little bit more slowly. So Vietnamese export figures have been a pretty good guide over the years. And as you can see, they're getting bigger and bigger in this period, January to April. So if there's 760,000 tonnes, let's call it, imported by the end of April, that's 7% higher than last year. And last year, between May and December, Vietnam imported an additional 117,000 tonnes. Some is harvested later, some was in the hands of traders, but material kept coming actually until December in 2024 from Cambodia. So what we're seeing is that let's add 117,000 tonnes on. That would mean that the crop might be a little bit bigger. So originally the forecast of the crop was 900,000 tonnes. Then we marked it back, the associations in Cambodia marked it back, the Ministry of Agriculture in Cambodia marked it back to about 840,000 tonnes. Well, it actually looks now as if it might be closer to the first figure, might be closer to the first estimate. A lot of the talk about pests and rains might have been just, effort to support market prices. Or it could have been that the information is just not good or just not available. But one thing is for clear, that the Cambodian crop looks good this year based on these figures. And we're not talking about estimates or forecasts, we're talking about trade. If Cambodia were to export another 120,000 tonnes and maybe process about 30,000 tonnes, you are looking at a crop of about 900,000 tonnes. And this is part of the reason why we see later buying in West Africa. The larger the Cambodian crop gets, the less the pressure on Vietnamese processors to buy in West Africa. If you get 1 million tonnes and you're processing 200,000 per month, well, that's 5 months. If you take the Vietnamese crop on top of that, that's 6.5 months. That means you don't need West African raw cashew nuts. And we haven't spoken about East African imports. You don't need West African raw cashew nuts until July. If you buy in Tanzania, as Vietnamese processors did in 2024, you may not actually need West African raw cashew nuts till the end of July for processing in August. Big question is, how do you manage that? How do you manage that in West Africa if the product is going to move later? You don't have any warehouses. You don't have good drying facilities. And you don't have processing, at least yet. Big questions. Let's switch to demand for a few minutes. Let's ask ourselves, looking at Vietnam's export figures, and bear in mind, Vietnam's providing about 70% of the world's export traded cashews. What does it tell us about demand? And we just look at our 4 major countries as good examples. We look at the USA because it's a huge market. We look at China because it's a fast growing market. We look at the Netherlands because it's representative of the European Union. And we look at the UAE as representative of the markets in West Asia, North Africa. So the USA, first of all, January to April shipments down by 26%. April in particular seems to have been quite a slow month. So that puts paid to my theory of lots of early shipments to get inside the deadline. So I'm not sure if my theory's right anymore when I look at this. 26% down in terms of shipments from Vietnam. Now we do know, of course, that in 2024 the US imported big volumes, enough, 23% higher than the previous year, enough to keep it going for some time. So we shouldn't be surprised by this at all. But it does kind of indicate that maybe of accelerated shipments in April isn't as great as it might seem. Let's look at China. Overall up 11%. This is interesting. Shipments to the Netherlands up 3%. The European Union had a big year for increased demand last year, and it seems to be working away steadily. In the Middle East, or at least in the UAE, imports or shipments from Vietnam are up by 11%. That's a little bit surprising given the prices. So we can probably say, looking at these figures, that with an increase of 11% in shipments to China, 11% to UAE, that price rises do not appear to have impacted those markets yet. In the European Union, steady increase. Now, we haven't probably seen the impact of price rises at retail level in the European Union as yet, but we certainly have seen them and still the imports, at least into the Netherlands, also into Germany. I don't want to put too much on the screen. Also into Germany, the second largest market, are pretty steady. So maybe there will be an impact of higher prices from consumers later, but so far, not at all. The US, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. Either it is a slowdown due to concerns. More likely, it's a hangover from the big imports of last year. So more than likely, the imports of last year carried in safe and secure, good supply, in the knowledge that there would be some turmoil with regard to import tariffs in 2025. Possibly, although April 2025 is well down on last year, possibly it would have been lower if it wasn't for some late shipments to get inside the tariff window. Overall, you've got to say, with the exception of the US, demand looks surprisingly resilient. You should also say, and we should also remember, it takes a while for price rises to come in, but it is already about a year. Now, it was May last year that we started to see this price increase. Having said that, let's not forget that, especially in the Netherlands, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, there's a lot of forward contracting. So people will have already purchased. When prices started to go up last year, they will already have covered most of what they needed for the year. So you would expect to see the impact of higher prices in this year. You would expect to have seen it by now. In China, where there's much less forward contracting, and in the UAE, where there's much less forward contracting, you would have expected that if there was going to be a big impact of higher cashew prices, we would have seen it by now. In fact, we've seen the opposite. Now, there may be other factors at play. There's definitely enthusiasm amongst consumers for cashews. That much we do know. There may also be concern on the import of tree nuts from the United States, where there is tariffs. So people are looking at cashews as a better idea. Maybe they're bringing in less almonds. Maybe they're bringing in less pistachios. And they're looking at cashews, in which case it's good news for the cashew business. So demand signals somewhat mixed, but generally what we didn't expect is that demand would be as resilient in the face of higher prices. As I said earlier, we're still looking at about 65 to 85 cents higher per pound than this time last year. So I said that the Vietnamese processors are preparing to talk to the government, and rightly so. Governments, many governments, are discussing or attempting to discuss their approach on the tariffs that the United States has introduced or is threatening to introduce. The impact of that on processing of cashews in Vietnam could be enormous, particularly in the long term. And Vietnamese processors may see themselves under pressure from a number of directions. So US tariffs threatened 46%. I don't believe it'll be 46%, but there will be a tariff. That threatens their access to the US market. The US market accounts for about 30% of exports of cashew kernels from Vietnam. That's a big market share. Industry profit margins have been under pressure for some time. We know that higher raw cashew nut prices, higher supply chain costs, lower prices for 2 years, which is, I've said on this GME with Jim, I've said a number of times that was a self-inflicted injury, but nonetheless it was an injury. And industry profit margins have been under pressure everywhere, but particularly in Vietnam. What might be described as protectionism in West Africa, export windows, export taxes, in one case an export ban, that is also disrupting business in Vietnam, cashew business in Vietnam. And we should also remember that as African countries rely on Vietnam as a major buyer of their raw cashew nuts, and ironically, their biggest customer for cashew kernels through the Burma cashew kernels trade, protectionism in West Africa does have a big impact. And finally, the activity of China in Cambodia, which is, as far as I can see, and I was in Cambodia not long ago, is pretty much exaggerated. There is some Chinese investment, of course, in cashews in Cambodia. There is some Chinese trading, but if you look at the actual exports and if you look at the protocols for trade, there's not a great deal going on. But you could understand why Vietnamese processors feel that they are under enormous pressure, and they are, and you could understand why their government might move to support them, if only through strong negotiation on tariffs. It's interesting that Vietnam is a major exporter of foodstuffs to the United States, but Vietnam is also an importer of foodstuffs from the United States, including fruit and fresh foods, which is quite an interesting factor. So if we're talking about predicting the future, and I suppose in a way we always are, I don't think you'll see 46% duty, but I think you will see maybe 10%. And that will be a threat to the Vietnamese processing industry. So you very much justify some of the cases they're making, although in my opinion, some of the points might be a little bit overstated. Let's switch to Africa and look at the news. And there's quite a bit of news this week. Just 6 things I want to highlight. Let's start with Côte d'Ivoire. So it looks like there's problems for the regulators in paying the processing export subsidy. It's said to be a cash flow issue related to the shortage, or the shorter or later exports of raw cashew nuts. So, you know, in theory, what's meant to happen is that the export tax is meant to fund the subsidy. And it's a pretty smart, pretty elegant solution that they came up with during the World Bank negotiation back in 2018. But now that the RCN trade is a little bit disrupted, and it's not the volume, the rate, it's just the actual shipment. So this is the reason. And it looks, according to what I hear, that the subsidy will end. Not immediately, but in the near enough future. Maybe next year, maybe the year after. That's going to have an impact, I think. I think that a number of processors rely on the subsidy. I think that some processors may decide they don't want to go on. They won't close their businesses, but they might change them, they might sell them, they might change the approach. So I think we will see some volatility in the Ivorian cashew processing sector if and when the subsidy ends. We also, and I mentioned it a little earlier, that there's reports that processors bought 650,000 tons. Don't interpret that as meaning they will process all of it. A lot of that will be exported. Many companies that are processors are also traders of RCN. What about in Cote d'Ivoire's neighbour, Ghana? Well, we're seeing now the introduction of an export licensing. The language is unclear to me, but it appears to be export licensing of RCN deal by deal. That's quite a bit of bureaucracy, so I'm not really sure how that's going to work if Ghana exports. Well, it's exports product from Kenya, product from all surrounding countries. But it's going to be export licensed. Not sure how that works. Not sure. I am sure how it works. I'm not sure. In Nigeria, I hear, this is not official, but I do hear processors are looking for a sourcing window. That would be unusual because Nigeria really doesn't have extensive cashew policy. So how you could legislate sourcing window policy is somewhat questionable. And I think that I wonder if Nigerian processors really want that, or are they just opportunistically trying to take advantage of what goes on in other countries? Why are people building processing factories if it doesn't work in Nigeria? Fact is, it does work. And they're building processing factories as a result. Do they need any more assistance? I'm not so sure about that. If you're efficient, you can pay the price. You have a huge supply chain cost advantage over Asian countries. The days of Vietnamese processors having a huge cost advantage over African processors are gone. If you're modern, mechanized, well managed, if you know how to sell, you don't have a cost disadvantage anymore. So maybe companies should be looking inside rather than outside for help. In Benin, it looks like, according to what I hear, that the major problems managing the supply chain continue. That the system that we discussed a little bit last time is not really working very well. Shockingly, processing may be well down on last year. It was meant to be up. It was hoped about 120,000 tons would be processed. That would have been a little bit more than 50% of the crop. From what I hear, and I hope that it changes, but from what I hear, it's going to be a lot less than that, a lot less than that. And we could see the problem of this idea of an export ban and increased processing, together with the inability to enforce the ban. And we should also note that if the ban were really in place, what would happen to farm gate prices? But this looks as if it's running into some management troubles, let's call it. Burkina, I've mentioned, there seems to be a discussion to end the export suspension. When that will happen, anybody's guess. It may already have happened in the last day or so, but I haven't heard the news. But there is a discussion going on, I understand. And finally, in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, so if you follow those markets, you'll know that in recent years, up until 2023, there was a big trade, maybe over 3.5 years, a big trade from Guinea-Bissau, illegal, into Senegal for export. And the product would go to Ziguinchor, and then it would go to Dakar, and then it would be exported. From Senegal. It would be identified as Bissau Guinean, and it would go to India and Vietnam. Last year that stopped, generally speaking. The big slowdown in that trade, changes in policy, and the product flowed through the port of Bissau, as it probably should. But there seems to be an indicator now that the cross-border trade is returning. I'm not really sure what the logic of that would be, given the changes to the system this year, as I understand it, are only minor. But there is a hint that may be returning, and we look for more information on that in the coming weeks. So generally speaking, in Africa, we've seen quite an eventful period. We've seen some interesting news come out. We've seen really some surprising regulatory discussions, surprising initiatives, and some things that were inevitable. The end of the subsidy in Cote d'Ivoire is inevitable. It's done its work. Why continue? At least why continue subsidising well-established factories, multinational factories? Might be a different story for locally owned factories. And we see, hopefully, an end to that export suspension in Burkina Faso, and maybe a little bit of a rethink for next year in Benin. So in terms of our outlook, I think right now, when we look at the available stocks in India and in Vietnam, I haven't spoken much about India this time. I spoke about it last time. We'll talk about India again. We're looking to see how the crop develops there. I am getting conflicting messages on the Indian crop. One week I hear things are better, other week I hear things are not so good. This week we heard a little bit more concerns. But the calendar is starting to become a concern. What do I mean by that? I mean, if we bought something today, raw cashew nuts, to be processed in Vietnam or in India, when would it get there? When would it be processed? When would it be available to re-export? Obviously, as the weeks go on, that gets later and later. So if the stock that's available lasts till June, you would imagine that you would need to have raw cashew nuts landing toward the end of June, ready for shipment in July. We're in May already. So how long people can wait depends on what their stocks are and depends on what their sales are. Secondly, we are seeing, and this is an indicator that there are shipments happening, we're seeing some pressure building on logistics. We're seeing delays in certain ports, delays in Lomé, delays in Conakry, as I understand it. Is that a sign of a surge in exports? Is that a sign that exports have now started to roll again? Well, we're going to find out over the next couple of weeks. But that possibly is going to delay shipments. You could actually, between the calendar pressure on processors and logistical issues, you could read into the situation that there could be a tightening of physical supply of raw cashew nuts in the middle of the year. Don't get the idea that that's going to push prices up too much. It's unlikely to, but it could cause processing in Vietnam to slow down a little bit. It could cause price rises in India, but I don't think they'll be long-lived, because as soon as you get a switch in prices, you'll see a lot of shipments behind it. So let's call it, you could see a mid-year slowdown in processing and a little bit of a price blip, but it won't last long. Farm gate prices, I'm talking across West Africa, are below minimum. So you've got an interesting situation here. You've got not too much buying interest, so farm gate prices are low. But at the same time, farmers, because they had a good start in many cases, because they had good quality, good pricing early on, they are actually have ability to hold on. Now, if farmers are holding on to stocks, it means that those stocks more than likely are declining in quality, because there isn't, at farm level, there isn't an infrastructure, there isn't the capacity to store raw cashew nuts for a long time, particularly if it's raining. Particularly if it's raining and they're stored in polypropylene bags, which is almost always the case. So this is one of the reasons why the slowdown in the season, and now I'm going back to what we were saying earlier about later demand from Vietnam because of increasing production in Cambodia. This is starting to roll up into a problem of infrastructure in West Africa. The problem has been there for a long time. The problem has been flagged for literally 10 years, not only by me, but by many other people. Now you're seeing this begin to become an issue. So what we see is later shipments because of later demand with lack of logistical infrastructure to cope with that, and therefore decline in quality. We all know how important it is to dry cashews properly and how to store them properly. That makes the difference between good yielding and some of the stuff that we've seen in recent years in the low 40s or even below that. I would say that those people that are holding inventories of raw cashew nuts might be just getting a little bit nervous now, because you're still not seeing a big surge in buying, and we're still seeing arrivals, and we're seeing relatively slow shipments. So you could see a situation where you get big shipments that people have shipped possibly without sales, and into June and into July you start to get some heavy arrivals. That would be the opposite scenario to the one I've just described, where the logistics and calendar pressure combine to cause a shortage. So it could go either way. It depends on how much people are shipping unsold, how much inventory they have, and how anxious they are to move it on. So the outlook at the moment is still somewhat uncertain. I suppose that's what makes it interesting. I don't think that this means volatility in the kernels market. I do think it could mean some volatility in the RCN market in the weeks to come. So that is my view on the short-term situation, my view on where we are right now. Let's sit back for a minute and do something that I think is a kind of relaxing exercise, and just think, what might the cashew sector look like 10 years from now? We'll start off and we'll have a look at production and consumption trends. So if you look at production, that's the green bars, this is what we get since 2009. Steady production growth driven by West Africa all the way through until around 2019, 2020. Then we got the surge in Cambodia, the M23 boom in production, and the number, okay, we all know the 2021 crop in Cambodia is not clear, but it definitely was a big crop. What did it do? It caused surplus. Supply and demand over the following 3 years, supply was always greater than demand, and we know what happens to prices during that period. We also got, in 2022, an economic slowdown. We got inflation in the West particularly, we got higher energy costs, we got people more cautious and less interested to buy products like cashews. Actually less interested to buy everything, but it impacted our business. Following year, from 2023 and into 2024, we saw lower prices boosting demand in Asia, particularly in China and in India. So we went from a demand spike to a slowdown to a low price in new markets. And this is all part of the shift of demand from Western countries, North America and the European Union, to Asia. And I think that's going to be a long-term trend. So when we look at it now, supply has grown faster than demand since 2019. And that's reversing the trends of previous years. So you can see it was always very, very closely matched. If you get a small crop problem, the market goes through the roof. 2016, 2017, then a big crop in 18, prices straight down again. Even a suspicion of a poor crop back in 2011, 2012 sent prices through the roof. So in 2024, we got a little bit of a rebalance when a poorer crop sent these prices that had frankly become too low back up toward more normal levels. And now we're within, what did we say recently? We're within about 10% of the 5-year average price. What might that look like over the next 5 or 6 years? So I did a little bit of a projection over the next few years up to 2031. So green, so you can, this is green, that's production, this is red, that's demand or consumption. If we just project that trend, and this is not taking into account any impact of bad weather or climate change or anything else, what it takes into account is what trees are planted but not yielding, what is the impact of price, what is the impact of tree age, what are the new plantings that took place over the last 5 or 6 years. So when we draw that forward, we get production higher than demand. And so I looked at demand in two scenarios. I looked at demand in a kind of an optimistic scenario where lower prices stimulated better demand. And I looked at demand in the current situation where we just forecast, based on what's been happening, what would happen over the next 6 years. In both cases, surplus until about 2029, and then it starts to even up again. So the market's been in surplus. The 2024 is an indicator, especially in China and India, that we could see a rebalance on this optimistic demand scenario. We could see a rebalancing of supply and demand around 2028. That, of course, assumes good crops. If you get a bad crop, it's a different story, but this is forecasting based on past trends. But the current demand trend shows that this market will remain in surplus beyond 2030. So we do need to do something to boost the demand for cashew nuts. There's no question about that. If we continue to produce or increase production more quickly than demand, we will eventually run into a situation where prices really start to get weak. As it stands, the surplus is pretty narrow. If production were to start moving up, it's unlikely, but if you were to get another surge like we got from Cambodia 2020, 2021, and this started going up here, prices will definitely start to fall again. We will definitely get an oversupply. So what's driving demand is increases in Europe in a small way, big increases in China, India. Even if that continues at the rate it's been going, we're not going to enter into a situation of anywhere close to a balanced supply and demand in the next 5 or 6 years. Beyond that, yes. But in the next 5 or 6 years, it doesn't look likely. Trends in consumption. And these are, we talk about boosting demand and rebalancing supply and demand. Trends in consumption, this is what we need to tune into. Traceable and transparent supply chains. If we look particularly at the European Union, but also other markets, responsible and sustainable sourcing. And in the longer run, it's more than likely that governments and consumers around the world will start to increase their interest in responsible sourcing and sustainable sourcing. Food safety at maximum residue levels, well established everywhere. Requirements are becoming tighter and tighter. If we talk about marketing, we talk about storytelling in marketing, conscience-driven consumption, important factors in building markets, especially at the moment in Europe. We could see a demand surge in India and in China. I was in India in February and I was really impressed, and I'm really believing that there could be a demand surge for edible nuts in India in the coming years. We could see cashews spread much further through the population, and we could see therefore that demand will grow. That is not assumed and not built into my projections, but it could happen. Similarly in China, positive signs, but still China, given the population, is a relatively small consumer of cashews, but is increasingly important in the world. Increase in consumption, generally speaking, in developing countries, that's a trend. That would be a trend that would be interrupted by recession. That would be a trend that would be interrupted by disruption due to these tariffs that may come in. And the other and final factor, but not by any means the biggest factor, is a diversification in the application for nuts. But we have to look at these trends and we have to ask ourselves, how well is the cashew supply chain aligned with these trends? Is a sector that ships 3.5 to 4 million tons of raw cashew nuts halfway around the world to be processed, and then ships about 70% of that back to markets all over the world. Is that aligned with responsible and sustainable sourcing? Is it aligned with traceable and transparent supply chains or food safety? How are you going to tell that story if you're marketing a cashew product? So when we look at it, we really need to think about how well is our supply chain aligned with the trends in consumption. And like I said before, nobody absolutely needs cashew nuts. They want cashew nuts. They buy them for all of the taste, texture, health benefits, other perceptions. But these things can turn. And we really need to look at this supply chain. And we really need to see, how do we boost demand when we've got a supply chain that's completely out of line with the trends? And then you could look at some businesses that are aligned with the trends. Businesses like Cashew Coast, Coastal Cashew. Businesses there's one or two in Benin. There's one or two in Nigeria that are well aligned with these trends and how they're thriving. And those are the examples that we need to follow. What about from the production side? What are the key trends in production? I think going toward 2035 origin-based processing, partly for the reasons that we've just spoken about in terms of consumption trends, but also the simple economics of it, much better and much closer supply chain linkages. So you really need to have origin-based processing in order to be linked to the farmers and the growers. I don't think it's going to change from being smallholders. I think it will continue to be smallholders. So it's a challenge to build those linkages, but it's only those linkages that allow longer term our supply chain to be in conformity with consumers' demands. Increased technology and processing, almost certain. We are somewhat away from the next big step forward, but there is one definitely going to happen. We're going to see increasingly the impact of climate change. That will mean less predictable weather patterns, more extreme weather, drier weather in some areas, wetter weather in others. We've seen in Cambodia, we've seen in West Africa, we've seen in India major impacts. We saw only this year in Vietnam heavy rains disrupting the harvest. Probably we'll see again a reduced use of chemical inputs. We are seeing the impact in some countries. We've seen it in the past in Vietnam. We're beginning to see it in Cambodia, that the heavy use of chemical inputs, although it may boost yields, does have a price. And that price is the failure to meet maximum residue levels on exports. So we can possibly see pressure to reduce the use of chemical inputs, which means that some of these very high yields will not be able to be produced, at least in the same way that they're done now. So it might mean that different varieties, it might mean better management in order to produce high yields, or it might mean more use of natural inputs. And finally, I think that we will see more consumer packing at origin. I'm just highlighting an example there of a pack from Cambodia, grown, packed, supplied from Cambodia. So in the production side, we are likely to see some changes. We are certainly likely to see much more processing at origin. And if we look at our supply chain as it stands, again, we've got to ask the same questions. How fit is the supply chain in 2025 for what might be the demands placed on it 10 years from now? And I think what it means is more investment in origin-based processing. Not 100% of cashews will be processed in the countries they grow in. There will always be a trade, for the foreseeable future at least, there'll always be a trade in raw cashew nuts. So perhaps processors in the major processing countries need to build better supply chain linkages with farmers and cooperatives and local businesses in the countries in which those products grow. And maybe that would be the first step toward rationalizing the supply chain, because it would introduce an opportunity to have a traceable, more transparent supply chain that's more in line with the legislation in some of the major markets. Processing in 2035, well, I think it's going to be automated and large scale, at least at the top end. It's going to be low labor and it's going to be high investment. We're on that road already. Questions about it: are the varieties being grown suitable for automated large scale processing? For example, if you have a lot of rework in peeling, does that fit with this model? Probably not. So we need to look at that. Is the post-harvest system adequate? Well, it's 100% not. As we know, if you want to have an automated large-scale process, you need to make that work. You need few exceptions. You need as homogeneous raw material as possible. You need ways to manage the post-harvest handling. And right now, that infrastructure doesn't exist. It certainly doesn't exist in West Africa. So are we fit for future developments in that respect? Probably not. Finally, I would just add in one thing: the grading system, which the grading system was invented in India many years ago, based on a manual process. I think this system needs to be revised. I don't think anyone needs 36, 46. If you count them up and you consider variations in local grading, you get over 50 different grades. I don't think we need that. I don't think that lends itself to modern food processing. It certainly doesn't lend itself to the development of automated large-scale processing. We have too many grades. We have too many variations. We need to work something a little bit simpler, a little bit more likely to work in an automated process. It needs to be revised, and boy, is that a job, because you've got how many producing countries? Many of them with their own specifications, no generic promotion. That would be, in my opinion, something that would take us a long way forward. And I'm not saying we need to take the UN or the CEPCI or the Ivorian standard or the Ghanaian standard. I'm not saying we need to take those and change them. What I'm saying is we need to fundamentally review the way cashews are graded and presented to customers in terms of size, in terms of colour, in terms of breakage. So, what might the sector look like in 10 years? Well, here's my view. First of all, West Africa production growth will have slowed down, mostly on the impact of climate change, but most cashews that are grown there, most means more than 50%, it doesn't mean 100%. Most of the cashews that are processed, that are grown here, are processed here in West Africa. In East Africa, production probably hits about 1 million tonnes, but processing still limited. Tanzania will have some outstanding examples. Mozambique will continue, but it's hard to see how that's going to pick up and develop. In Vietnam, I think there will be less product processed in Vietnam. That means less shipped from West Africa or East Africa, but there will be more value added products. There'll be more roasted, more consumer packs produced in Vietnam. So actually the value of the industry may not change an awful lot, but the volume will, the way I see it. If we look in Cambodia, it will still be the largest individual country as a producer because it will grow in its production, whereas in West Africa, I think production will stabilize. It will also be a significant processor, and we will get some form of interaction between Vietnam and Cambodia. We'll get some investment from China, and we'll get some investment from Western countries, particularly Europe, in processing in Cambodia that will make Cambodia a significant processor. If we look at Indonesia, I think Indonesia will by then be a net importer of cashew nuts. Huge country, does consume considerable quantities of nuts. By then, I think Indonesia will be a net importer. India, production probably will increase, but slowly. So it's gone blue. and it will continue to be a fast growing but a net importer. Those imports will probably still be raw cashew nuts, but it will be increasingly difficult to buy raw cashew nuts because they'll be processed in West Africa, they'll be a little bit more processed in East Africa. Indonesia will have turned to be an importer, and Cambodia will be processing more and supplying the Vietnamese industry. So the supply of raw cashew nuts might just become an issue, particularly if you have a market that's still protected by very high import duties on cashew kernels. Brazil, I think, similar situation. Brazil will become a net importer of cashew nuts by 2035. There's no sign that production is increasing, consumption is increasing. Huge country, Brazil, of course, and I think it will be a net importer of cashews by then. China will be, by 2035, the world's largest single country market in volume terms. I think I've no doubt about that. China will not grow cashews. China doesn't have the climate or the right conditions for growing of cashew nuts, so will be big importer. That product will come from, not just from Vietnam or Cambodia, it'll come from everywhere. We could see Chinese investment in processing around the world. Not sure about that, whether it'll happen or not. There's a lot of interesting projects to invest in, but certainly will see China grow as a consumer. Europe will be the second largest market, big interest in what cashew nuts offer, and all trends tend to indicate growth. And I think finally the US market will be fairly static. It'll be slow growing. I don't see a huge surge in cashew imports into the United States. But obviously if the tariffs come in, that'll happen quicker. So what we're seeing in big terms is the opposite of what we saw from 1970 to 2020. We're seeing, instead of product shifting from west to east for processing, we're seeing product shifting, or processing shift from east to west, that is from Asia to Africa. And we're seeing the opposite in demand. We're going to see the balance of demand change from, as it was in the 1980s, 1990s, shifting from the West, Europe and the United States, to the East as India continues to grow, as China grows, and of course other markets in East Asia will grow too. The roots of these trends are already in place. It's unlikely I'll be right in all of these things. Some will be right, some will be wrong. But I think generally speaking, if we look at that in the broad sense, more consumption in Asia, continued growth in Western countries, but it'll be outpaced by growth in Asia, and more processing at origin, because that's what the trends are demanding. And probably the trade lanes will change too. So you'll have much more West Africa, US, Europe. Consumption in the regions will be supplied from the regions. So overall outlook then, in my opinion, and I'm really interested to hear other people's opinion on this, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to chat about it. Production growth is slowing down. Origin-based processing will dominate, and that may be automated, large-scale, high-investment processing, except for India, which will continue to be an importer of raw cashew nuts, to Asia, but Europe becomes the largest Western market. So there's some thoughts on now and some thoughts on 10 years from now. And let me hand you back to Stella if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Yes, we have a couple of questions. And the first one is in relation to the India-UK Free Trade Agreement. Has this recent FTA created new opportunities for India to boost its kernel exports to the UK?
I don't think so. Not unless you're going to be really competitive on price. There were no tariffs on cashews before it. There's no tariffs on cashews afterwards. So it may have many benefits for trade between the UK and India, but I don't think they're going to impact cashew kernels. So,
Jim, could you please explain again the factors which can balance or at least drive up consumption in the future?
well, if we can, as a sector, become more aligned with consumer interest, consumer demand, we should be able to boost consumption. So at the moment, we have a situation in which the product, cashew kernels, is actually not promoted on a generic basis. Let's go and promote our product so that we can avoid that scenario. They did that, they did it very successfully, and they ended up rapidly increasing production and rapidly increasing price. Now, you might say it was easy for them to do that, and maybe it was. They had a lot of resources. They were very, very centrally located. California in the United States is the main producer of almonds. But we should take lessons from their marketing approach. And what they did was they reinvented almonds. They reinvented almonds from being a bakery ingredient to being a snack food, to being a supplier of milk, to being a supplier of a whole range of confectionery products, to becoming a protein, to becoming a snack in the sense of a natural, healthy snack, as well as what we perceived at that time as nuts being fatty, unhealthy but tasting great. They changed that. Nuts are a natural, healthy snack. So they, at that time, aligned themselves with consumer needs, and they created some new consumer needs at the same time by diversifying the applications and telling the story in a different way. That happens in cashews, but very slowly, and it's never initiated by the production origins. It's never initiated by the processors. They prefer to compete with each other on basically on price. So if we were to align our sector with consumer trends and consumer demand, if we were to align our sector with ideas of traceable, transparent supply chains, responsible sourcing, sourcing in which human rights are respected, workers' rights are respected, that suppliers on farms are paid prices that allow them to make some money, at least make a living out of their activity, that would work much better with consumers. We would then have a story to tell, and storytelling is important. At the moment, it'd be best not really to tell the story of cashews. So you can tell the story of cashews if you have a supply chain that's based on local product, where you can identify the suppliers, where you can identify the product, where you can tell the full story without hiding anything. But for most of the supply chain, you can't do that because it's carbon footprint, it's treatment of its growers. In some cases, though less so, its treatment of its workers is not something that would go down well with consumers. So until we have a supply chain in which we can tell the story openly within these ideas of traceable, responsible and sustainable sourcing, we're going to have real problems boosting demand. And that can only be done, in my opinion, on a generic basis. By that I mean that different organizations in different countries work together to promote the product and not just to promote their own interests. And right now we have a typical old-fashioned adversarial approach in the industry. You catch me one year, I'll catch you the next year. We have to kill that culture off as well. Moving forward, we can see why this has evolved. It's evolved because the diversity of the supply chain. It's evolved because of slow investment in African countries. It's happened because the lack of major food multinationals in the industry, and it's happened because of the culture around our business. If we don't change that, we won't boost consumption, we won't boost demand, lower prices is not a way to boost consumption for long-term success. There are much better ways to do this, and we can look at other nuts, and almonds is a good example, but pistachio is another one where we can see exactly the right approaches being taken and from which we could learn in the cashew sector. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. I'm taking you back to Vietnam. What is more likely to happen if the 46% tariff in Vietnam remains? Will it drive down the prices of RCN or more surplus stock of RCN remains in Africa?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. It's obviously it's what if. So what do I think? I think that if the 46% were to be maintained, that you would see a fall in demand in the United States. You would see a competitive advantage for processors in Africa. At the moment, the American importers have not been particularly active in Africa. Only 7% of the American imports are from African countries. The equivalent in Europe is 20%, 21% for January, March this year, 3 times the American figure. I think that what we would see is a big slowdown in processing in Vietnam, a readjustment, increased processing in West Africa. I think we would see prices in West Africa rise a little, prices from Vietnam probably fall a little, but overall it's not good news for demand. It would be a sign, if the 46% were to be maintained, it would be a sign that overall negotiations on trade have failed. That would probably lead to a recession, and that's not me saying that, that's every economist that you read saying that. And if you get that recession, then you get an impact on demand. So I think that we would get possibly short-term good news for West Africa, bad news for Vietnam, clearly, but overall not good news for the economies and probably not good news for the cashew sector as a whole. I'm optimistic. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be optimistic, but I am optimistic, and I don't think that'll happen. I think there will be some agreement. I wouldn't be surprised if food products were to be taken out of this tariff war completely. I can't see any strategic interest for the United States in taxing foodstuffs from developing countries. I can't see any strategic or political interest for the United States government in increasing the price of food for American consumers. We'll see. Stella?
Thank you very much, Jim. The next GME is scheduled for May 28th. What should we expect?
Well, on May 28th, we're going to have a much better opportunity to have a look at how the crops have evolved. That's 3 weeks from now. I'm going to have a look at India, hopefully. Give India a little bit more attention because the Indian crop will have evolved more by then. So I'm proposing to do a crop review, have a look particularly at the Indian situation, and we'll see by then, by the 28th, we'll have another month's figures on trade, so we'll be able to have a look at demand too. I don't expect this to be particularly volatile month, but as always, it's going to be interesting. Stella?
Thank you very much, Jim, for today's session. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank our partners and sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, GSA Movecom Cashew, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and the Cashew Club. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone that's joined us today. You can see my numbers and my email address on the screen. I'm always happy to talk cashews. See you next time.
See you, Jim, and I'm back with some few announcements. Be reminded of the 19th AC Annual Cashew Conference and Expo that will take place from November 18 to 21st at the GNICC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. If you register now, you enjoy up to 40% off all conference rates. Also, the Global Market Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick are available on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A, where you can watch over 80 recordings at any time. I would like to encourage you to stay online and enjoy the discussion box for your networking session. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.